So I know that we had a smaller group last Friday, which is fun. But just as a quick recap of what we went over in Friday's class. So what we did on Friday was a practice short essay question, right? So remember that on the midterm exam, half multiple choice, half short essay. The short essay question, right, is a pretty good example of what you might expect to see on the exam. It covered a definition of culture and how it relates to strategies of conflict management. So you can consider that question. I've actually received a request or two from a student. If you would like my feedback on your question, you want to know how you would do on the exam, you answered that question, you're welcome to send me a draft or just let me know, hey, I want you to look at my paper copy. Another thing you can do is if you were not here last Friday, you might look over the question and practice it for yourself in preparation for the exam. I'm going to be offering some additional practice questions posted on Canvas to help you out, along with the study guide by Wednesday. Remember that the midterm is November 3rd through 5th, so it's 2 weeks from Wednesday. It's open note, open book. So in other words, we'll use November 1st as a review day for the exam. You can take it online, either on campus, at home, wherever works best for you, between November 3rd through 5th. You have 72 hours, and then once you choose to take it, you've got 2 hours to complete it. So we went over that. We also talked a little bit about culture, right? Culture being the major topic of Chapter 4 of JANT, and an area that helps us to make sense of the context for conflict a little bit more. So we'll be diving a little bit more into detail about culture today. And then we also used a bit of time last Friday to brainstorm the study circle topics, but I also wanted to give you more time over the weekend to do that. So we'll talk a little bit more about culture, including the ways that members of different cultures and groups might choose to engage in conflict management, and then how intercultural communication can happen. Again, intercultural communication is a course that's taught within the communication program. Dr. Chen oftentimes will teach that class, and it's a great way for us to understand how members of different groups communicate with one another. So we oftentimes notice, right, there's pretty significant political, social, cultural differences that we have in our communication strategies. It oftentimes feels like, our values or beliefs look really different than people that we might not know as well. So intercultural communication is a great way to dive into those issues in more detail. Again, culture is kind of the rules that we play by. It's the set of rules that in many ways govern our reality and our approach to experiences, right? It involves our thoughts, our experiences, and our behaviors. So culture is this constant doing. It's a performance. So for instance, if you are celebrating a holiday, so maybe you're lighting a menorah, you're putting presents under a Christmas tree, right? The way that you're doing that as this constant behavior is a big element of culture. It has certain assumptions and values and also rules that guide how its members behave. So for instance, if one example that was actually brought up in a previous class is in Korean households, it's a norm or a rule that the oldest member of the family will eat first, and it kind of goes down to the youngest member at the end. So these kinds of unwritten rules and assumptions and behaviors are things that we use a lot of times to make sense of and try to understand a little bit more about different cultures. So one kind of fun video that I think helps us to think about
this week
and the relationship between cultures is this piece here.
On journeys into unknown cultures to the NASA region. Between the Grand River and the 49th parallel lives a curious union of people. Collectively, they are known as the Nesarima. This week, we will see the Nesarima in 2 residential settings: the urban, highly populated areas and the rural, less populated regions. Also, we will observe Nasarima cultural practices such as food acquisition, consumption, recreation, and dwelling upkeep. While the Nasarima control a vast amount of land, most of its peoples live in densely populated areas. These urban centers are laid out with mathematical precision to maximize their use of space. This creates a more organized population. One residential edifice can house thousands of people. Rural Nasarima life is different. The dwellings are spread apart, leaving more space for a smaller amount of people. Their rural land is covered by towering trees, and on the ground is a mix of monocot and dicot flora. There is a ritual beheading of this flora, which takes place every week or so, depending on rainfall. Food purchasing and preparation has changed drastically over the last few decades for the Nasarima. Very few families grow what they need to eat. The family used to gather together and eat after the day's work was done. Currently, 50 million Nasarima natives use what is called a drive-through window to purchase their daily meals, and they don't even have to leave their means of transportation. Many of the Nasarima do work that requires little physical activity. This means with regular food consumption, their body has no way to use the entire caloric intake. To compensate, they regularly run in place or around their community. Most Nasarima don't enjoy this, but do so to keep their body mass index acceptable. Many Nasarima depend on each other for survival. Food, water, construction, and law enforcement are all provided by other people. This allows one person to specialize and sell their talents to the community. While this is for the most part advantageous, any major breakdown in society would leave the Nasarima helpless. Thank you for joining us on our latest installment of Journeys into Unknown Cultures.
So, it's kind of a silly way of thinking about and understanding culture, right? So, Nasarima, if you're not familiar with this project, right, is America, or American, spelled backwards. And it actually was a project that began in the kind of 1950s as a way of imagining, if we were to examine American culture and society as an outsider, how would we write about it? How would we talk about it? So this video is kind of silly, right? But it's discussion about the beheading of the fauna, right? To correspond to mowing the lawn, or the way that there's this ritual running in place, like using something like a treadmill or going out for a jog, is a way to reframe and think about what many of us do on a regular basis in a different light. So the ritual piece is called Body Ritual of the Nasarima, and it has a lot of other things, like you see the ritual mouth men or dentists, right, on a regular basis. We use a shrine, like a bathroom, and so on. So it's oftentimes the way that many folks, including those in the United States, write or think about other cultures, but using that same script to define our culture. Because as members of a culture, society, or group, we oftentimes think about what we do as just this natural, normal thing. But if it's written about or talked about from an outsider perspective, like beheading the fauna, right, it suddenly sounds way different, weird, and maybe silly. And so oftentimes what we take for granted as normal within our culture is something that seems very different to an outsider, and is one way that potential conflict can emerge in regards to conflict. So I thought it was a kind of fun way for us to think about and use an example to look at the role the culture has. Right? So culture is something that oftentimes is tied, although not exclusively so, to ethnicity. So ethnicity can cover different elements, but generally speaking, ethnicity is more about sharing a descent or heritage. So one thing that's become a lot more popular in recent years has been the use of ancestry and other genetic databases in order to make sense of and track things such as your family history, your genealogy, and some of the genetic components that you might share. right? That kind of gets into the role of ethnicity. So the kind of Umatilla reservation that includes both parts of Eastern Oregon as well as around the Walla Walla, right, is a home for a variety of indigenous groups in the area, many of whom share commonalities in terms of ethnicity and heritage. And that's a way of us thinking about and using ethnicity as a potential way to define a culture. Right? So when it comes to thinking about a culture, its behavior and its traits, one way of thinking about culture that's been put forward by many authors, including Edward Hall, who is considered a foundation in cultural studies or an understanding of how different cultures behave and act, are these kind of dimensions or spectrums. So you can think about it in terms of one or the other. You can also think about cultures in terms of groups occupying spaces in between, right? So an example here is low versus high context culture. You see here that some countries, right, are lower or higher context, but some don't necessarily follow an extreme. So low context is an idea that we brought up earlier, but it's the idea that you say what you mean. So typically in a low context culture, there is very little ambiguity or uncertainty in your communication. One idea is that most often our verbal communication is more explicit and has less context, although there is some context depending on the situation, whereas our nonverbal communication tends to be higher context. One example of this, right, is our use of gestures. So for instance, using something like a nod in the United States might mean yes, whereas shaking your head means no, but in some cultures, tilting your head to the side can actually mean yes. So depending on the situation, your nonverbal communication is read very differently. Additionally, right, context matters in terms of our language choice. So a high context culture, generally speaking, has language that could mean very different things depending on the knowledge that members of the group have over that topic. For instance, in languages such as Mandarin, right, saying a word and pronouncing it in a slightly different way means something entirely different. So context matters in terms of defining cultures and some of the issues that cultures might have, right? One challenge that can happen and a potential cause of conflict is that members of different cultures might misinterpret or not make sense of context. So for instance, in countries such as Japan that are much higher context, rather than saying yes or no directly, somebody might say yes hesitantly or maybe and look to the side. In situations like that, if somebody just says no as a cultural outsider, that could be read as a kind of faux pas or behavior that's not considered acceptable among members of that culture. So that's one thing that I think is important for us to think about as a dimension. Another dimension we've talked a lot about in the class so far is individualism versus collectivism. In fact, it's one of the major ways that we found different conflict styles, such as collaboration, negotiation, accommodating, and so on, right? An individualistic culture, which is something like the United States, tends to focus more on your individual achievement, on reaching goals and succeeding, whereas a collectivistic culture tends to focus more on the harmony and interest of the group, right? Another way that we can think about cultures differently is in terms of masculinity versus femininity. There's a couple different ways to interpret this, right? You could both think about or measure cultures in terms of the degree to which their behavior might be coded as more masculine or feminine, but also in the way that depending on the culture or group, their views surrounding gender could look very different, right? So depending on the culture, the clothing choices, the types of behaviors that are considered ideal or preferred among members of that group could look very different, right? What does it mean to be a woman, man, or somebody that might exist outside of that space, right? Uncertainty avoidance is another really key idea, right? So one theory in communication studies is this idea of uncertainty reduction, and the idea that we essentially try to use our communication with other people to get more familiar with them and to feel that comfort over time. So, uncertainty avoidance is this idea that with members of other cultures or groups that we don't know very well, we're generally less interested in getting to know or understand. Oftentimes, it comes out of something like a fear of difference, right? Where because somebody's a member of a different culture or group, you might feel less comfortable around or less willing to seek communication with that group. So uncertainty avoidance is one way that cultures can differ, right? And we oftentimes think about cultures in terms of nationality, but that's not always what culture is. It can include a lot of different components, our ethnicity. It can also include our memberships in, for instance, clubs, organizations, extracurriculars, and so on. There's also the idea of our orientation, long or short term. And this is how it relates to time, right? So in countries like the United States or Britain, there's a focus on being very future-oriented. That is, there tends to be a much longer discussion about long-term plans. I got a spam email this morning about having a meeting to discuss retirement, right? Which really speaks to the degree to which something like those long-term, very far-out plans are put on the pedestal. So a more short-term orientation might be a culture or group that's much more focused on the present. And then lastly is this idea of indulgence versus restraint, right? So depending on the culture, there might be a greater emphasis on controlling or restraining the language choices that we can make. To what degree do you feel comfortable sharing your feelings or being yourself? How regulated is that? Versus a culture with greater indulgence might be focused more on being more direct, on sharing and pursuing your goals and interests, and so on. So these different spectrums are ways to measure and contrast different cultures. Depending on the culture you're part of or that you're engaging with, right? These can be a big source of potential areas of conflict. So for many of us who are thinking about applying these skills, if you have an internship or you have a professional opportunity or you're thinking about your current job or your career after graduation, right? You might be thinking about how you're going to engage and work with members of different cultures and groups. And some of these dimensions are ways that we can understand some of these differences, right? So, for instance, if you're setting up something like a meeting, say you have a 12 o'clock Zoom meeting, and somebody arrives a few minutes late, how might members of that culture's time orientation lead to them thinking that showing up to a meeting late is acceptable or more casual versus longer time orientation that views planning and things like that as a little bit more strict. So that can be one way that we can understand and apply some of the differences that we feel regularly when it comes to our own communication. So Dr. Stelting-Toomey puts together an idea that I think is a really useful way for us to contextualize and make sense of culture even more. I previewed this last class, but it's this idea of face work, right? Especially in more collectivistic cultures, given that the harmony and well-being of an overall group is really important, face work is a way that we can manage and regulate the relationships that we have with other people. So face work essentially deals with the idea that we have this face or public version of ourselves that we share as part of members of a society, a culture, a group, and so on. So for instance, if you're a member of a religious or spiritual organization, right, you might want to come across as being a good member of the group, being supportive of contributing to that organization. But if you did something like insult a leader in that group, maybe you feel like you have hurt that face or public image, and you might take action to save face. Maybe it's publicly apologizing, or maybe it's working extra hard to offset the negative reputation that you might have had, right? So face work is the idea that we are constantly managing the public face or the way that we perceive ourselves to other people. Areas like public relations get into this topic a lot, right? The way that we manage our identity in relationship to other people. There's even a film, 2004 film called Saving Face, that deals with a direct kind of media example of that. want to show you kind of a trailer from that movie to help us to get a better sense of this topic too.
How come we never met before now? We did meet. I was 8, you were 9. The long boys were taunting me. You beat the heck out of them.
Will has a surprise for her mother.
You talked to your mother about us? Does she know we have sex? No, Will. She thinks we conjugate Latin verbs.
Her mother
什么时候开始喝啤酒啊?
is not listening.
Seriously, well, why don't you just tell her?
She knows.
She kept setting you up with guys.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because she has a surprise
Son? What are you doing here?
of her own.
Baby. Who's the father? She won't say. I'd like to meet her. You don't know my mom. Exactly. 你有没有男朋友啊? Do you know what kind of karmic hell I'd have to pay as a Chinese daughter who didn't take in her own mom? So marry her own.
What about Mr. Park over at Snarly Belly?
My landlord's a Chinese guy. He's not very chatty, but he's rich.
Welcome, Dano.
Now mother and daughter
你什么时候回来?
will face their fears
Kiss me. Right here in front of all these people.
and find a way to find each other.
是他。
Joe Chen,
喂，真不能相信你是我肚子里出来。
Michelle Kruzik,
Hi.
So this is a film, right, that deals with sort of a mother-daughter couple and the unique challenges that they face in that relationship, right? It's a Chinese-American family, and given a lot of the kind of norms and assumptions among members of that group, there's both this, the daughter character, right, identifies as lesbian and is in a relationship with a woman but is not comfortable sharing or disclosing that to her mother because of her mother's assumptions or beliefs about things such as relationships, marriage, and so on. Turns out, right, the mother is pregnant but doesn't want to disclose that to her daughter because of fears about norms and acceptable times to have kids and so on that might also tie to culture. So this deals with the idea of face work, right, in relationships because both the mother and daughter are trying to hide and regulate the things that they disclose to one another in relationship to culture, what both of them might see as acceptable to behave in terms of behavior and engagement with each other and so on. So the idea of saving face is this idea of managing and regulating our relationships with other people in accordance with how we believe we should behave in culture or society. Good catch. So, another way to kind of think about and break apart how culture shapes ourselves, right, is this kind of within culture map that's proposed in this chapter. So when we think about how we look at conflict, one of the things that you all brought up in the first week of class is that oftentimes conflict doesn't end well. Maybe you deal with a conflict and, once the conflict wraps up, you feel like neither person got much out of it. Or sometimes it feels like you're having a conversation and you don't necessarily understand the other person. So not only do we communicate among members of different cultures and deal with conflict that can happen because we have people that come from very different cultural backgrounds as us, but also our own background, our upbringing has shaped the way that we approach conflicts, right? So, for instance, our family relationships are one major way of assessing conflict management. So if you see somebody like a therapist or counselor, they'll typically ask you to complete an intake form. And one big component is to understand your own family and how your family approaches conflict. So both my parents were social workers, right? They worked for helping adopted children to basically finalize and get into their new homes. And one thing that unfortunately was a really common trend, right, was that the conflict styles, including potentially abusive conflict styles, right, could oftentimes pass down from generation to generation. And that's a difficult cycle to break out of. That's oftentimes because we look at things like modeling for behavior from our parents or guardians, and that can inform a lot of the ways that we view our own styles of conflict. So that can be a really foundational aspect of how we look at conflict, is we look at how our family members approach it, and we might consider using a similar approach. Also, right, our social friends, things such as people close to us, like an employer, can also play a pretty big role, right? So maybe if you're doing an internship, right, you look up to your boss, their style of managing or handling conflict, and you can use that about how you approach conflict yourself. So maybe you're working, in something like retail or customer service, and your supervisor helps you to manage how you deal with more difficult customers, right? That could be an approach that you take on yourself. Members of coworkers, right, or colleagues, these are these kind of peer relationships that you have. So in terms of class like this, right, it's other students. How are you doing in your classes, dealing with some of the unique challenges that you balancing everything that goes into being a student. So that can shape your approach to conflict. And then other kind of non-family relationships, people like your neighbors, people that you might encounter more casually, and so on. One component that I'd add here that I don't think is listed, but I think helps us to apply this even more, is looking at our relationships through things like social media, celebrity behavior, and so on, right? One idea of the parasocial relationship is that we form relationships that are one-sided, like there's a celebrity that we follow, we're interested in, we identify with. Oftentimes, right, there's like feuds or disagreements that can come online, and we might model that behavior for our approach to conflict too. So in other words, our conflict styles aren't set in stone, but the way that we view conflict, either as something that is positive and happens all the time, or something that is to be avoided at all costs, is very much shaped by our experiences. For instance, in France, it's actually really common for people to regularly engage in a kind of logical or detached conflict with each other on a lot of different issues of the day. It's just something that people do. And so that can be an approach that has culture informing how we view conflict. Another idea here, right, is the between persons cultural grid, which I introduced and talked a little bit about last class, but it can help us to understand how conflict can come about among members of different cultures or groups, right? And this is measured both in terms of the expectation we have about how somebody is going to behave and whether the behavior of that group is similar or different to our own culture, right? So we can have a situation in which we have an interaction with somebody else that's very similar to us and that we feel positively about. So for instance, maybe it's you and another student, and you're talking about, how to schedule your winter classes, and you realize that you and them have a lot of similarities in how you balance those needs. You could also have a situation in which you have a positive impression of somebody that comes from a very different cultural background as you do. So for instance, maybe you're meeting with a foreign exchange student, and you and that student are working together in terms of housing, lodging, and so on, but you really like this student, you've been working together for a while. So having a different or negative expectation of somebody else and having the same behavior, one aspect as well, and then noticing this kind of different behavior than what we expect, viewing that negatively, can be another one. In other words, right, we oftentimes will use shortcuts such as stereotypes in order to imagine how members of another culture might behave or act, and based on whether they conform to or violate beliefs that we have, we might react very, very differently, right? So oftentimes, one source of conflict can be that the assumptions and beliefs that we have kind of run in contrast to what we might expect out of that conflict situation. So one thing that I kind of want you to take some time to think about is kind of in terms of issues about rural, urban, and so on considerations. So, right, you live in Eastern Oregon and in and around the LaGrande area, which, of course, in terms of the overall state of Oregon is very different in terms of the unique issues that might impact rural communities. And Also, in terms of the way that culture relates more broadly between rural, urban, and so on. Oftentimes, coming in from the western side of the state, I noticed that there were a lot of assumptions or stereotypes made about more rural communities, but at the same time, right, there's also concerns that might be brought about urban communities too. So what I'd like you to do is to find a couple other folks to work with. You can form maybe a small group, anywhere between 2 to 4 or 5. And what I'd like you to do is have the group members chat a bit about these questions. What might be some of the challenges of communicating about rural issues to somebody that was totally unfamiliar to rural issues or communities? And then what role does culture play in understanding the different needs that members of these different types of groups might face? So find a couple folks to work with, and then I'll ask that each group shares your thoughts, including your name on these, and I'll be grabbing that later for attendance. You can either write it or type it, but think about these questions and chat about them with people in your group for a few minutes.
So
I'll give you a couple minutes to finish up here. It seems like a lot of the conversation is kind of wrapped up. So I'd love to hear from a few groups in terms of some of the ideas that you shared. So I know this middle group here in the front seems like has some really interesting points about different locations and the way that space and culture, urban, rural, and so on find. Would you all like to share anything that came up in your conversation?
Yeah, we can. We just talked a lot about like that, space is different, looking at communication styles, lingo, how we give directions, the scope of issues who affect what are the different issues that affect everybody versus what you see in an urban community. Everyone does it differently. I know we talked a lot about yes regionally because like I'm from the western part of the state and I am not gonna be the Lord. But my definition of rural compared to a lot of my friends is very different. Because I'd say I grew up in a rural area over in the Williams Valley, but it's valley rural. So it was completely different than what Eastern Oregon rural looks like, where it's hundreds of thousands of acres comparatively. So
Yeah. I really like this idea that what we define as rural or what we define as a group is, of course, really different, right? One of the challenges of defining something like rural or urban or suburban is like, how do we distinguish those things together? What counts as urban or rural and so on? So some really interesting points there. How about this group here on the end? What were some things that came up in your conversation?
So some challenges is that they might not know how like conflict in that area is dealt with, and then they might be like uneducated on the topics so it's like hard for them to understand the conflict.
Yeah.
And
Right. Expertise and knowledge about a topic and how to approach that is definitely a big source of potential disagreement, right? If you're a cultural outsider or you're not somebody that knows the ins and outs of the conflict, it can be a lot harder for you to understand the different interests that are at play there, right? So if you suddenly jump into a city council meeting and you offer your opinion about how we should use water irrigation, and you don't know the topic at all, right? That might not be might not be received very well, right? How about this group back here in the corner? I think you all have some interesting insights to offer as well.
So we talked about how like urban communities and schools aren't really like, I don't know, like their traditions are way different than like your traditions. Like rodeos are being considered inhumane and dangerous and scary, and part of our culture is that like, oh, rodeos in town, everyone go to the fairgrounds and have a good time.
Right.
But so that they just aren't as like not saying dumb, but they're not educated in the same way that we're educated, I guess.
Right. How we view or sort of value different practices, something like rodeo, right? Is this a good thing, a part of a culture and identity? Is it seen as negative, right? Our knowledge about these different topics plays a really big role too. And deals with this idea, right, of like ethnocentrism, or somebody believing that their culture is better than another culture, is something that we have to actively try to combat and work on to understand and engage with other groups. So I really like these points that came up from groups. I was, listening to some of the conversations that you all had, and I was really kind of interested in how not only you all have defined these differences, but also in how you talked about yourselves within and across some of these cultural differences, right? So for many of us, we might not identify with a single culture, even in terms of location, right? If you're visiting or coming to EOU from another location, sort of dealing with both being part of a group, but also moving into a very different location and set of experiences can really shape our experience as well. So culture can be thought of both in terms of place and space, and can really relate to different challenges about how we view different activities and practices, but also in our expertise and understanding of issues that might impact us in ways that outsiders might not be familiar with. So these are all things to continue to think about when we examine culture, identity, communication, and so on. Right? So culture is about our shared set of experiences. It's about how our behavior, our membership, things like groups impacts who we are, how we choose to communicate. Right? Conflict can happen in terms of our own culture and experiences that we have, and the upbringing that might inform our approach to conflict. And it can happen between different cultures, right? Intercultural conflict and being members of other groups can impact this too. So for next class, Cody, Angelin, Joe, Brenna, Logan, and Patty will be doing the study circle. So they'll be our first group. I'll give them a little bit of time to prepare on Wednesday, and they'll go in there. So coming in, right, you all who are doing the study circle for Wednesday, stay tuned for the Canvas announcement with the topics. I'll have that before 5 p.m. tonight. Take some time to maybe think through the topic a little bit. You don't need to know a whole lot or have a whole lot to say about it, but you can bring in some initial thoughts or ideas. And then if you're not doing the study circle on Wednesday, you can consider you're taking notes and observing the study circle for yourself. So I will grab your group work for today, as well as any ideas or preferences for your study circle topic that you worked on at the beginning of class. Otherwise, I hope that you all have a great Monday, and I will see you all again on Wednesday.